Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources and build a high-speed, comprehensive understanding of a world-changing idea just for you. Today, we are strapping in for a truly rigorous intellectual journey into the mind of Thomas Hobbes. Most people, when they hear that name, think immediately of one thing: absolute power, the Leviathan. They think of the state as this monstrous, unavoidable authority.
That's right. Hobbes is famously the theorist of relentless, singular, and, unquestionable authority.
Yeah.
But if we dig into the material you shared, we realize that his political theory wasn't born out of some love of brute force or simple tyranny. It was a profound, systematic, and frankly desperate response to a world that seemed to be dissolving into overwhelming moral and intellectual chaos. The Leviathan state is the necessary cure for radical, self-destructive doubt.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that framing completely changes the stakes. We are not just talking about politics, we are talking about a total system of thought metaphysics, science, ethics, and politics, all built from the ground up. What intellectual crises was he actually trying to solve in the 17th century? Because 17th century Europe seems, by all accounts, to have been a very frightening place to be a philosopher.
It wasn't just frightening, it was intellectually destabilizing. Hobbes was tackling a monumental problem. How do you build a coherent system of knowledge when the foundations, the twin pillars of religious certainty and classical moral philosophy, had been utterly corrupted or destroyed? Our mission today is to trace that relentless logical path. We need to understand how his materialist science led, by strict necessity, to a specific kind of relativistic ethics, and why that specific relativism, in turn, necessitated his shocking political conclusion that the only logical escape from total individual freedom and self-destruction is absolute submission to a common judge.
So before we jump into the cold, mechanical logic he's famous for, let's start with the man himself. We often picture Hobbes as this severe mechanical mind, but his origins were actually deeply rooted in the Renaissance, a world of language and classical learning.
Absolutely. Hobbes was a humanist, trained in the Renaissance curriculum. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, which were crucial skills that weren't just academic. They were highly marketable tools for a bright but lower-class boy trying to advance socially in early 17th century England. His education was all about classical literature, rhetoric, and the stylish, persuasive use of language. That education secured him employment in the household of the great aristocratic Cavendish family in 1608, a placement that became the central organizing feature of his intellectual life.
And we see that humanist training immediately reflected in his first major publication, a translation of the Greek historian Thucydides in 1629. That translation wasn't just an academic exercise, was it? It reflected the intense political anxieties of his employers, the Cavendishes, and the wider European context.
Precisely. His work for the Cavendishes involved travel and extensive networking, particularly concerning their Venetian contacts. The Venetian Republic at that time was obsessed with maintaining its precarious republican independence against the growing hegemony of the Spanish Empire. They were intensely interested in the political lessons of antiquity, but they weren't looking for the moral uplift of Plato or the community spirit of Aristotle.
They saw in Thucydides, the historian of the disastrous Peloponnesian War, a more suitable guide for their cynical, dangerous era.
Exactly. Thucydides provides a brutal, unsentimental account of how great powers behave, focusing on interest, calculation, and the devastating results of internal conflict. This choice of text signals a major intellectual shift happening across Europe, the collapse of the high-minded political idealism associated with Cicero.
Can we elaborate on that collapse? What was the Ciceronian ideal and what replaced it?
The Ciceronian ideal, dominant in the early Renaissance, was the idea of the vir bonus, the good man engaged in an effective, honorable public life. It assumed that politics could be governed by virtue, justice, and effective rhetoric. But by the late 16th century, that idealism was considered pure fantasy, a naive delusion. The political reality across Europe was defined by dynastic maneuvering, religious wars, court intrigue, the brutal pragmatism known as reason of state, or ragion di Stato.
So instead of studying how to be virtuous, thinkers were studying how to survive in a cynical Machiavellian world.
Precisely. This led to a huge resurgence of interest in Tacitus. Tacitus detailed the inner life of princes under tyranny, flattery, treachery, and a constant atmosphere of suspicion and cruelty, a peace more brutal than war. The entire genre of political literature shifted to capturing the pervasive skepticism that the public sphere was driven not by noble ends, but by naked ambition, fear, and manipulation.
And this secular cynicism was turbocharged by the shock of religious conflict.
Absolutely. The post-Reformation wars of religion, especially the French wars of religion and the ongoing violence in the Netherlands, caused profound existential shock. It was the ultimate demonstration that religion, the supposed source of moral unity and eternal truth, had become the firebrand of sedition. Thinkers like Justus Lipsius, a key figure in the Tacitist movement, lamented this collapse, saying, "Good Lord, what firebrands of sedition hath religion kindled under a pretext of piety?"
That sounds like intellectual despair. If your political system is cynical and your religious framework is killing people, where do you turn for certainty?
You retreat. This despair led many to revive ancient philosophies that prioritize disengagement from the corrupt world. We see a resurgence of ancient skepticism, derived from Pyrrho and Carneades, urging ataraxia, the complete suspension of belief, because if no one can agree on truth, it's safer to believe nothing firmly. Alongside this, there was Stoicism, promoting apatheia, the elimination of intense emotion and passionate commitment, because passion always leads to faction and suffering.
This moral relativism is perfectly captured by the famous reflection from Montaigne. What truth is that which these mountains bound, and is a lie in the world beyond them?
That one phrase distills the central problem Hobbes inherited. If ethical truth shifts simply by crossing a river or a mountain range, if what is virtue in Italy is vice in England, how can any moral principle be universally valid? This irresolvable disagreement in ethics was Hobbes's philosophical inheritance. It wasn't just abstract. The skeptics attacked Aristotelianism, the dominant philosophy, by pointing out the astonishing diversity of ethical belief, the endless disagreements, and the unreliability of sense perception, like optical illusions. Everything determinate was falling apart.
So if morality, tradition, religion, and even sensory perception were falling apart, was there anything left? Was there a single universal principle that survived this skeptical onslaught?
Yes. This is the crucial pivot for Hobbes. Amidst this total intellectual wreckage, one unmalleable principle remained intact, one truth about human conduct that everyone, regardless of culture or creed, had to acknowledge. Men both do and must seek their own self-preservation.
That's the rock bottom. It's not a noble goal, it's just raw necessity.
It is the core defensive stance of the late 16th century skeptics. We mentioned the anecdote of the ancient skeptic Carneades, who argued forcefully that the wise man must seize the only plank in a shipwreck, even if it meant pushing another person off. This illustrates the logic. Self-preservation is the fundamental, non-negotiable obligation. Anything that endangers it, even something praised by Cicero, like public spiritedness or selfless patriotism, was viewed by figures like Montaigne and Lipsius as a dangerous vulnerability.
So Hobbes seized on this raw necessity, but how does he transform it from a mere observation, people want to live, into the foundational moral right upon which his entire political structure is built?
That transformation happens only after he integrates this humanistic realization with a revolutionary new understanding of the physical world. He realized that to make self-preservation the foundation of politics, he first had to make it the foundation of science. He couldn't rely on the skeptical, unreliable human senses, so he had to build a system of certainty based on material causation. The moment he proved that the world was nothing but matter and motion, survival became the only meaningful goal.
This brings us to section 2, where Hobbes, the classical humanist, transformed into Hobbes, the radical scientist. His philosophical awakening in the 1630s was directly influenced by his employers, the Cavendish family, and their intense interest in military technology.
That's a fascinating and often overlooked connection. For the Cavendishes, military matters, improving defenses, understanding ballistics, advancing optics for telescopes were paramount. A proper understanding of this new technology required engagement with the new anti-Aristotelian science emerging in continental Europe.
Right. Aristotle's physics, which dominated academic thought for centuries, relied heavily on observations through the senses and notions like objects seeking their natural place. This new military science must have exposed the practical weaknesses of that old system.
Absolutely. The old science couldn't accurately predict the arc of a cannonball or the magnification power of a lens. The physical world needed to be understood in terms of predictable mathematical motion. In 1634, Hobbes, acting as the family's intellectual servant, was commissioned to buy a copy of Galileo's foundational work, Dialogue, concerning the two chief systems of the world.
And he didn't just read it, he met Galileo himself during a grand tour in 1636. This exposure, plus his time corresponding with figures like Gassendi and Marin Mersenne in Paris, the so-called Mersenne Circle, made him part of what you could call the 17th century intellectual Silicon Valley.
That's a great analogy. This group was the epicenter of a new philosophical movement. Their mission wasn't just to replace Aristotle. It was to retain the critical skeptical insights of humanism while marrying them to a systematic natural science that could finally achieve unshakable certainty. They realized that the primary skeptical attack, the one that caused all the chaos, rested on challenging the validity of sensory observation, optical illusions, dreams, etc.
So their answer was radical, conceding the skeptic's point that our senses lie, but then building a new system that accounts for that lie. This is the prison of the mind.
Precisely. It's the core insight shared by Galileo, Descartes, Gassendi, and Hobbes around the same time, though they're different conclusions. The radical idea is that there need be no resemblance between what we experience internally, color, taste, sound, and the external material world that caused it. External reality is, to use the source material's phrase, incapable of being experienced in its true character.
So if I see a red rose, the color red isn't actually in the rose.
No, the color red is solely an internal phenomenon. Think of it like a computer monitor, to use a modern analogy. The colors you see on your screen aren't inherently in the screen. They are just electrical signals, motion telling your brain to perceive red or blue. The rose is just particles in motion reflecting certain wavelengths, causing emotion inside your eye and brain, which your consciousness interprets as the fantasy of redness. We only perceive these internal seemings and apparitions, or phantasms, caused by external motion.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we accept this radical idea that our senses only give us internal fantasies, how does Hobbes avoid Descartes' hyperbolical doubt, the terrifying prospect that the entire external world might melt away, leaving the observer isolated in purely imaginary perceptions? Descartes had to resort to proving a benevolent God exists.
That's the philosophical dividing line. Descartes tried to start with the self cogito ergo sum, and then used God as the guarantor of external reality. Hobbes thought that was intellectually weak and failed to solve the problem for a true skeptic. If you remove the benevolent God, Descartes' system crumbles into super-skepticism.
So Hobbes' answer was to root his entire system in materialist metaphysics, starting with the cause, not the self.
Yes. He employed a thought experiment, the solipsist thought experiment. Imagine the entire world annihilated, save for one man. This man would still have images and ideas of things he had previously seen, while these remaining images would be only ideas and phantasms internally happening. They must, by definition, have been caused by something external previously. This confirms the undeniable existence of prior material causes.
And this is where he introduces his key logical principle that locks the system down, the principle of sufficient reason.
Exactly. This principle dictates that nothing can move itself. No action is uncaused. Change in the world must be caused by a cause, and that cause must be an adjacent body, material objects in motion. Hobbes defined the external world as consisting solely of these motions. Crucially, this relentless logic rules out any incorporeal substances like spirits or souls that can act on their own, because that would violate the principle that everything is moved by an adjacent body. He constructed a completely mechanical, deterministic universe, thereby grounding external reality without needing God or unreliable human senses.
If the universe is entirely mechanical, then the human self must be mechanical too. Hobbes famously rejected the Cartesian ego, that idea of a separate observing mind.
He saw the self as imaginary, merely a convenient construct arising from our inability to conceive of thinking without the fantasy of a separate thinker. The self isn't a separate entity. It is the activity, the train of perceptions and reactions itself. If you try to think that you're thinking, then you must ask how you know that thought, which leads to an infinite chain of questions. The materialist system simplifies this. The self is simply one complex, determined link in the causal chain of matter in motion.
This mechanistic view profoundly alters the concept of freedom itself, tying directly back to the long debates Hobbes had with contemporaries like Bishop Bramhall. If everything is matter in motion, how can humans be free?
The traditional humanist and religious view was that the will, the internal power to choose, is free. Hobbes insists that the will itself cannot be free, because all thought and action is part of that determined causal chain of motion. He used a purely pragmatic definition of freedom, the condition of having no external hindrance to securing what one wants.
So a river is free to flow if it isn't blocked by a dam. A person is free if they aren't physically imprisoned.
That's right. Freedom is external, not internal. To illustrate the determined nature of the self, he used that fantastic analogy. A wooden top that is lashed by the boys, if it were sensible of its own motion, would think it proceeded from its own will, unless it felt what lashed it. The top is moving, it desires to spin, but the motion originates entirely from external forces.
Wait, if we are just wooden tops being lashed by external forces, if all action is determined, doesn't that completely undercut the entire basis of political philosophy? How can you have a binding social contract if no one is metaphysically free to choose to obey or disobey? Doesn't determinism undercut the very idea of moral or political obligation?
That's the classic liberal objection, and it hits at the heart of Hobbes's challenge. He would argue that the political mechanism is not based on metaphysical freedom, but on rational necessity. We may not be metaphysically free, but we are conscious of our desires and the impediments to them. The contract isn't an act of free will. It's the only rational choice made by a determined agent who realizes that the pursuit of self-preservation in the state of nature is perpetually frustrated.
Yeah.
The obligation arises because it is the necessary means to the end we are already determined to pursue, survival. He redefined the ground of obligation from abstract morality to pragmatic, unavoidable self-interest.
So Hobbes has this completely mechanical, deterministic view of man and the universe. Now, he applies that scientific rigor directly to morality, and the conclusion is immediate. If all our perceptions, including color, are merely internal fantasies caused by external motion, then morality must be equally relative and subjective.
It's ethical relativism derived as a scientific fact. Hobbes stated this plainly. Every man, for his own part, calleth that which pleaseth, and is delightful to himself, good. And that which displeases him is evil. Moral terms, good, evil, just, unjust, are illusions or fantasies, exactly like color terms. They are names we apply to our subjective desires and aversions.
So there is no such thing as simply good, or agathon haplos, as the Greeks would say, no objective, universal good that exists independently of the observer.
None whatsoever. And Hobbes sees this moral disagreement, the conflict over what to praise, condemn, or pursue, as the primary psychological cause of war, even more dangerous than naked self-interest. If two people disagree fundamentally on what constitutes a good life or a just act, they will inevitably try to destroy each other to enforce their own view. This is why he was so frightened of ideological warfare, particularly the wars of religion. The common idea that Hobbes was purely pessimistic about human nature is partially true, but he believed men primarily sought power only to secure their preservation, not simply to harm others. It is the disagreement about justice and goodness that ignites discord and makes that search for power violent.
To build an ethical system out of this total relativism, he turns to the one universal principle, self-preservation, which he transforms into the foundational natural right, adapting the work of Hugo Grotius.
Grotius had started the shift, proposing self-preservation as the foundational natural right, suggesting that some basic level of permitted violence was necessary for any society to survive. Hobbes seized on this to ground his system. His definition of right, or jus, is blameless liberty of using our own natural power and ability. Crucially, he insisted this right is limited only to self-preservation. It is the one common, unmalleable belief that can form a basis for agreement among men determined to live.
Now we come to the conceptual difficulty that plagued his critics. The logical tension between right and law, or jus and lex naturalis, they seem fundamentally at odds.
This distinction is absolutely critical to understanding how the state is necessary. Right? Jus is liberty, the liberty to do or to forbear. It depends solely upon the will of the individual agent, and in the state of nature, that liberty is unlimited for survival. Law, lex naturalis, on the other hand, is obligation, that which determineth and bindeth to one of them. They are indeed logically inconsistent. Liberty is the absence of obligation.
So the law of nature isn't some divine commandment. It's simply a rational dictate about how to achieve peace.
Precisely. It's an instruction manual. If one wishes to preserve oneself, the undisputed determined objective, following the law of nature, seeking peace, refraining from certain actions, is logically necessary. The law declares permanent and incontrovertible judgments about what will, in the long run, lead to our preservation. But here is the tension. The right ensures the individual agent is psychologically free to choose any immediate way to survive, even an irrational, self-defeating one. The law tells the agent what the rational path is.
If the law is rational and everyone wants to survive, why doesn't the law of nature instantly usher in peace? Even before the Leviathan, why don't people just follow the logical path?
Because of the fatal flaw, private judgment. This is Hobbes's most radical departure from Grotius, and the reason why the state of nature inevitably collapses into war. Even if we all agree on the right to self-preserve in the state of nature, every man by right of nature is judge himself of the necessity of the means and of the greatness of the danger.
So the problem isn't disagreement over the goal of survival, it's disagreement over the means, how to survive.
Exactly. Since there is no objective moral truth in doubtful cases, individual assessments of threat inevitably differ, and they must always be weighted in favor of the self. Let's say I see you walking down the road, whistling, swinging a big club. I might genuinely believe you pose an existential threat to me. Since I have the ultimate right of self-preservation, my assessment that you are a danger is justified by my right. I am compelled to preemptively strike you.
And I, meanwhile, might just be whistling happily, feeling entirely pacific, but because you look tense, I start to feel threatened, and the conflict escalates purely based on mutually suspicious private judgments.
That's the core instability. The fact that all men will make different decisions about what counts as a danger to them causes conflict to arise despite our agreement on the fundamental right to survival. The right of private judgment turns the state of nature into a state of war, savagery, and degradation. The famous solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short existence.
And Hobbes grounded this not just in abstract theory, but in real-world examples, noting that present-day Americans give us an example of this degraded state of savage conflict. That's a striking piece of political realism, using contemporary reports about indigenous tribal life, or what he perceived as a life without central authority, to justify his theoretical state of war.
It demonstrates his commitment to political realism. He saw the state of nature not as a historical fantasy, but as a present and constant possibility, exemplified by tribal societies lacking a unifying sovereign, or perhaps more disturbingly, exemplified by civil war itself, which is the dissolution of the sovereign power. The conclusion is inescapable. Abstract ethical agreement means nothing without enforced ideological and judicial alignment. Private judgment is the virus that prevents the law of nature from ever bringing peace.
The moment Hobbes identifies the fatal flaw, the instability caused by private judgment, the political solution becomes a mathematical necessity. If the problem is that every individual uses their own subjective reason to judge danger, then the answer must be to consolidate reason. If right reason is not existent, then the reason of some man or men must supply the place thereof.
The Leviathan is the structural, political solution to moral and judicial relativism. Since individuals cannot agree on objective right, good, or evil, the sovereign must step in to act as the common measure for all controversial terms, including right, good, virtue, and critically, meum and tuum, mine and yours. The sovereign creates the consensus that philosophy, religion, and the senses fail to provide.
This means the sovereign's power must extend into areas we would typically consider metaphysical or scientific. It must extend to defining reality itself.
Yes. And this is perhaps the most unsettling element of Hobbes's theory. In Elements of Law, he has that remarkable passage where he notes that concerning some strange and deformed birth, it shall not be decided by Aristotle or the philosophers whether the same be a man or no, but by the laws.
Wow. That is radical. That means even the definition of what constitutes a human being is placed entirely at the disposal of the sovereign.
Because in doubtful cases, and all cases requiring a common rule are doubtful, there is no objective fact of the matter in nature or philosophy to appeal to. Therefore, the law must create the certainty. The sovereign's definition must be accepted as reality for the sake of peace. The entire political project is predicated on the idea that arbitrary power over the most important matters in our lives is required to achieve certainty and prevent a return to the war of all against all.
How does this common measure come into being? What is the fundamental nature of this sovereign power?
It's created by a contractual surrender. The Commonwealth is created when men agree to submit their wills, everyone to his will, and their judgments to his judgment. This is the foundational social contract, which is crucially made not with the sovereign, but between prospective citizens, agreeing to empower a third party. The sovereign represents the people, and the unity of the state lies solely in the unity of the representer, not the unity of the represented. The multitude of individuals is only unified through the sovereign.
And this unified, consolidated authority is massive. He calls the sovereign God's lieutenant, to whom in all doubtful cases we have submitted our private judgments. This certainly suggests unlimited power.
It does. But immediately we encounter a fascinating paradox: the moral duties of the sovereign. The power is absolute, but it is not directionless. The sovereign must act in order to the common peace and security. Hobbes repeatedly states that if the sovereign acts otherwise, it is a violation of the rational purpose for which the state was created. It's a breach of trust and of the law of nature. The sovereign is ultimately bound by the laws of nature to ensure the survival of the people, because the sovereign's own security is tied up with the citizen's safety. Persistent incompetence is irrational and immoral for the sovereign, though it does not necessarily give rise to a subject's right to rebel.
Let's discuss one of the most surprising and anti-liberal implications of this duty: the sovereign's power over property. We often associate Hobbes with the rise of competitive individualism, but his view on property seems almost communitarian when survival is at stake.
This is a huge point that flies in the face of subsequent liberal thinkers like Locke. Hobbes insists that the distribution of property is the sovereign's decision, made in order to the common peace and security. Property is not a pre-political natural right. This has massive implications. If the property distribution endangers the physical survival of citizens, if people do not have the material necessities of life, the sovereign is required to intervene and redistribute.
Wait, you are saying that if citizens are destitute, the absolute sovereign has a duty to take resources and redistribute them to prevent starvation. That sounds remarkably socialist. It runs completely counter to how we usually think of Hobbes. Can you unpack that duty further?
Hobbes is crystal clear on this point, because the survival of the individual is the sole reason the state exists. If the state allows its subjects to perish from want, it has failed its only duty. He writes that the Commonwealth must provide maintenance for the destitute. They are not to be left to the charity of private persons, but to be provided for, as far forth as the necessities of nature require, by the laws of the Commonwealth. This isn't charity. It is a mandatory mechanism of survival and public peace.
So while no right of private property can be pleaded against the sovereign's right to tax for defense and maintenance, the sovereign's actions must ultimately serve the goal of physical preservation for the entire body politic.
Exactly. His primary goal was always peace and security, and that is achieved through the preservation of the citizen body. Regarding the actual mechanism of taxation, he was pragmatic. He preferred taxation on articles of consumption over egalitarian taxation, arguing the former is less likely to incite antagonism among citizens, thus maintaining peace.
Finally, we must ask, even under this absolute power, what is the hard, fast limit of resistance? If the state is trying to kill me, does the contract still hold?
The contract dissolves the moment the state stops providing the reason for its existence: protection. The limit of resistance is found in the foundational premise, the logic of self-preservation. A man cannot lay down the right to resist those who assault him, to take away his life, even if the assailant is the sovereign or the sovereign's agents. Hobbes offers the stark, chilling example of criminals being led to execution under armed guard. They are not morally justified in rebelling to overthrow the state, but they are rationally choosing the lesser evil danger of death and resisting, rather than certain and present death and not resisting.
So a subject only has the right to resist when their physical survival is incontrovertibly endangered.
Precisely. Persistent incompetence, or even violations of moral duty by the sovereign, are not a right to organize a rebellion unless government breaks down entirely and protection ceases. Hobbes summarizes this by saying there is a mutual relation between protection and obedience. If the sovereign loses the ability to protect the citizen, the bond of obedience is automatically severed because the citizen reverts to the necessity of relying on their own strength for survival. But the right to resist is narrowly confined to the moment of existential threat to the individual, not to the stability of the state itself.
It is clear that the Leviathan's authority isn't just physical and legal, it has to be intellectual and religious too. This is where Hobbes' system really challenged his contemporaries and led to his reputation for atheism, or at the very least radical anti-clericalism. Let's start with how he addresses God within his materialist philosophy.
Hobbes establishes a purely minimalist, philosophical concept of God. Since philosophy, in his materialist system, can only concern itself with mental images, with physical causes and effects, and it is absolutely impossible to form a mental image of an incorporeal God, God is excluded from philosophical inquiry, save for one exception: the first cause in the causal sequence of the material universe.
So his materialist universe is a vast sequence of motions, but that sequence has to start somewhere. God is simply the necessary theoretical beginning.
Exactly. But this concept is devoid of all traditional religious content. The conventional attributes of God, benevolence, justice, omnipotence, are completely excluded from the philosophical concept. Hobbes argues that when we use those names, they merely signify our inability and defect of power to conceive anything concerning his nature. They are expressions of our limitation, not accurate descriptions of his being.
This raises a profound logical question regarding the laws of nature. If there are moral imperatives telling us what we ought to do for peace, but all morality is relative, who is the lawgiver for these universal dictates?
That's the critical juncture. He has to reconcile the materialist world with the moral force of the laws of nature. He concludes that the laws are commands only in respect of the author of nature, God Almighty, who is the first cause. But, and this is crucial, the reason we follow them is not out of piety or fear of divine punishment, but for reasons of rational self-preservation. The consequence of this distinction is revolutionary.
Because it places the motivation firmly back on the human agent and the deterministic need to survive.
Yes. Hobbes registered this fact when he denied that atheism was a sin of injustice or against the law of nature. Atheism for Hobbes is a sin of imprudence or ignorance, like denying any other philosophically compelling argument. But it doesn't violate a moral duty owed to God through natural law. The fear of God is not the basis for the state. The fear of death at the hands of one another is.
This minimalist deist understanding of God is clearly an effort to subordinate religious authority to civil authority.
Absolutely. The primary danger to the Leviathan is dual sovereignty. Hobbes was vehemently anti-clerical because he feared that churches formed bands of fanatics who claimed authority independent of the state and caused civil wars. The wars of religion had proven that unchecked ideological authority was the greatest threat to peace. Therefore, the sovereign must have the total right to legislate on intellectual matters and be judge of what opinions and doctrines are averse and what conducing to peace.
The logic here is brutal and clear. The actions of men proceed from their opinions. If the state needs stability, it must control the opinions that lead to destabilizing actions.
Exactly. This requires the sovereign to control public doctrine, silence disputes, and examine all books before publication. The sovereign's role here is fundamentally negative, to prevent non-sovereign clergy, university professors, philosophers, from claiming ideological authority that might incite rebellion. Hobbes points to the persecution of Galileo as the perfect historical example of what happens when the church has authority over opinion.
Can you elaborate on the Galileo example? How does that illustrate the necessity of the Leviathan?
Hobbes points out that Galileo was condemned for doctrines that were increasingly accepted by learned scientists. The church condemned him based on Scripture, claiming an ultimate ideological authority. Hobbes asks, but what reason is there for it? Under the Leviathan, this conflict of authority could not happen because the civil sovereign is the ultimate judge of all doctrine. If the sovereign determined that scientific truth was necessary for the peace and security of the realm, say, to improve military technology or navigation, then the sovereign would be compelled to endorse Galileo, and the clergy would have no authority to countermand that judgment.
And his late work, Leviathan, takes this anti-clericalism even further, becoming even more radical than his earlier philosophical drafts like De Civ.
In De Civ, Hobbes had offered a compromise. A Christian sovereign should still interpret Scripture through properly ordained clergy who followed the apostolic succession. But during the English Civil War, he abandoned that. Seeing the triumph of independency, which lacked a general ecclesiastical discipline and fractured centralized religious authority, he dismissed the apostolic succession entirely in Leviathan. He now argued that the sole interpreter of Scripture could only be the civil sovereign. He celebrated the victory of decentralized, self-governing churches because it resulted in a religious structure that was easily overridden and imposed purely by the state, freeing the sovereign from external ecclesiastical obligation altogether.
But to maintain this total intellectual coherence, Hobbes had to address Christianity's central promise. Eternal life, which seems utterly incompatible with a purely materialist universe where bodies in motion are the only reality.
He reconciled Christianity with materialism through a specific theological doctrine known as mortalism. The conventional idea is that we possess an incorporeal soul that separates at death and goes to heaven or hell. Hobbes rejects this entirely. He argued that eternal life requires a body and a place of habitation because everything real is material. Adam's original sin caused mortality, but Christ's return will raise the dead and grant them material existence again here on earth.
And what about eternal punishment? The soul doesn't burn forever.
No. If the soul is not incorporeal, it cannot exist independently to suffer eternal punishment. Hobbes argued that the ungodly will suffer a second and this time final death, unquote. Their material existence will simply cease. This materialist Christianity, as you can imagine, was greeted by his former friends as a farrago of Christian atheism, but it was necessary to make his system logically coherent. He had to excise any independent, incorporeal entity, be it God, the soul, or the autonomous will, that could defy the material laws or challenge the temporal authority of the Leviathan.
The relentless logic Hobbes built from materialist science through relativist ethics to the need for total political authority has made him one of the most complex and contested figures in the history of ideas. It's almost impossible to read him without feeling challenged. How has his work been interpreted over the centuries, especially since his conclusions are so uncomfortable?
Hobbes has been read in profoundly diverse ways, often depending on the prevailing political climate. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, he was generally classified as a modern natural law theorist. Thinkers like Grotius, Pufendorf, and even Locke, in some respects, were working to answer skepticism by grounding morality in a universal principle. And for Hobbes, that principle was self-preservation. He was seen as contributing to the project of secularizing political theory.
But then his reputation soured. Later readings repositioned him, casting him as the negative influence on modern society.
Correct. Leo Strauss, and especially C.B. Macpherson, famously read him as the demon of modernity, or the spokesman for possessive individualism. This interpretation, popular in the mid-20th century, argued that Hobbes established the philosophical attitudes, focusing only on self-interest and the perpetual acquisition of power that were necessary for competitive mercantile capitalism to flourish. The state was merely a necessary evil to keep these ruthless competitors from killing each other.
Yet, we just discussed his insistence that the sovereign must redistribute property to ensure the survival of the poorest. Doesn't that contradict the possessive individualism reading?
It creates a fascinating tension. The Hobbesian logic that supports the individual's relentless pursuit of security, which fuels competitive individualism, equally supports the sovereign's duty to intervene and redistribute property if that competition leads to the destitution of citizens. The Macpherson-Strauss argument tends to focus on the psychological starting point, while ignoring the ultimate political prescription designed to guarantee the minimal physical welfare of the citizen body.
And then we have the third major tradition, positioning him as a kind of proto-value-free social scientist.
This view, pushed by figures like Peters and Watkins, argues that Hobbes was primarily concerned with methodology. He used the resolutive compositive method, analyzing society by breaking man down into his mechanical parts and then reassembling him into the state to derive non-moral prescriptions or doctor's orders. The argument here is that the laws of nature are merely instrumental guides for utility maximization.
I know this view is very popular today, often applied using modern games theory.
Yes. David Gauthier, for example, used the prisoner's dilemma to argue that cooperation is impossible in the state of nature unless enforced by a powerful third party, the Leviathan. The rational choice in the state of nature is always to defect, act aggressively, leading to the worst outcome for everyone. The Leviathan resolves this dilemma by changing the payoff structure. However, this interpretation struggles because Hobbes limited rights only to self-preservation. Breaking the law for greater utility or greater profit is not a matter of right for Hobbes. It's still an irrational threat to peace. Hobbes was ultimately interested in right-wrong, as defined by the sovereign, not just pure utility maximization.
So after tracing this entire elaborate and rigorous path, from radical doubt in the 17th century to the absolute state, what is the fundamental paradox that still challenges us today?
The paradox lies in the relationship between radical skepticism and political certainty. Hobbes sought to live consistently after losing confidence in all existing beliefs, in a religion, in objective morality, in free will. This left him only with the bare a priori materialism in science and the bare principle of self-preservation in ethics. His conclusion, that the laws of one's country are constitutive of one's general morality, assigns the state absolute arbitrary power over the most important questions in our lives, such as defining justice or even humanity itself.
The terror of the Leviathan stems from its origin in our own intellectual freedom and doubt. The absence of objective truth creates a moral vacuum that, according to Hobbes, can only be filled by unquestionable, singular political authority to guarantee the only thing we all agree on: survival.
Precisely. If we reject Hobbes's illiberal conclusions, and most of us in the modern world certainly do, we must confront the full, frightening implications of the moral and scientific skepticism we may already share with him. Skepticism is often seen today as leading to pluralism and toleration. Hobbes demonstrates the exact opposite. When ethical conviction vanishes, the logical endpoint is the necessity of an absolute sovereign to define truth and enforce peace. Political stability becomes a purely manufactured construct.
That is a challenging thought to leave with. Modern liberals often assume that moral relativism naturally leads to pluralism and tolerance, but Hobbes forces us to confront the idea that doubt actually demands certainty. If you strip away all assumptions about natural rights, inherent goodness, and divine law, you are left with the choice between chaos and the Leviathan.
He forces you to identify your own philosophical anchor. We cannot simply choose to reinstate firm belief, but if we reject Hobbes' solution, we must be very clear about what non-arbitrary, universal moral or political assumption we rely on to justify limits on state power. Hobbes' logic is relentless. The absence of objective truth necessitates an unquestionable, singular authority to achieve peace. That relentless logic, the necessary price of peace in a world devoid of shared moral conviction, is the genius and the terror of the Leviathan.
Thank you for guiding us through the cold, hard logic of Thomas Hobbes. We hope this deep dive challenges you to consider what philosophical assumptions you rely on to justify limits on state power, if not absolute moral truth. Until next time.